It's a stormy, wet night in the city of Surat Thani in southern Thailand. And above the city's main airport, an Airbus A310 is hanging in the sky like a cross, just about to fall down. Now, there's no technical reason for this to be happening, so what has led up to this? On December 11, 1998, a Thai Airways crew arrived at Don Muang International Airport in Bangkok to operate Flight 261, which was a short domestic hop over towards Surat Thani. The aircraft they had been scheduled to fly was a wide-body Airbus A310, which is likely the smallest wide-body ever made, but it was still more than large enough for this one-hour domestic flight with only 132 scheduled passengers. It's not clear why exactly this A310 was used, when one of Thai Airways' Boeing 737-400s would have been better suited, but maybe it was just what was available on that night. In any case, with that low passenger load, the A310 would only be little over half full, but it still carried a full complement of 12 cabin crew, which together with the 2 pilots in the front, brought the total number of people on board up to 146. Now, the ages of the flight crew weren't specified in the final report, but we do know that the captain had been flying for Thai Airways for many years at this point and had 10,167 total flying hours. And that included over 3,000 on the Airbus A310 and its larger cousin, the A300, which have a common type rating. The first officer was less experienced, but wasn't new either. He had 2,839 total hours, of which almost all had been flown on this particular type. Both pilots had had a good rest before the flight, with more than 20 hours off duty, although it is worth noting here that the captain had logged more than 108 hours during the preceding 30 days, which would have been close to or maybe even over modern duty time limits. So he had been working a lot. Now, the final report doesn't mention any duty time violations here, so most likely Thailand's duty time requirements back in 1998 were not as stringent. But obviously, we have strict limits now because working more hours could cause chronic fatigue, and that is worth keeping in mind. Anyhow, before walking out of the aircraft, the pilots reviewed their dispatch paperwork, which included the weather forecast, notices to airmen or NOTAMs, as well as the aircraft technical log. And from there, they could see that the aircraft was in good working order, with no defects that would become relevant to this story. But the same could not be said about their destination airport, Surat Thani. It had been undergoing renovations for the last couple of years, with the pace increasing in late 1998, and Thailand's Department of Aviation had therefore issued several NOTAMs highlighting several systems that were inoperative. First of all, the Instrument Landing System, the ILS, which provides precision approach guidance, had been out of service since January of 1997, and in September of 1998, the approach light system had also been turned off. Then, in November, the Precision Approach Path Indicator, or PAPI lights, which tell us whether we are approaching too high or too low, also stopped working. And whilst the PAPI lights on the left-hand side of the runway was soon restored, the right side wasn't. Then the non-directional beacon that was located at the airport, which was used as a backup navigation aid, was being moved, so it didn't work either. And finally, the airport had shut down one of its 2 redundant electrical circuits, powering the runway edge and threshold lighting. So, as a result of that, only every other light was illuminated. A specific NOTAM about that reported that the spacing between the runway edge lights were therefore increased to 120 instead of 60 meters, and 6 meters instead of 3 meters for the threshold lights. Now, all of this was clearly some pretty serious degradations of Surat Thani's capabilities when it came to night or low visibility operations, and in fact, the airport no longer met the minimum equipment requirements for low-vis operations under the rules of the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO. You see, ICAO sets out very clear rules for what type of equipment can be missing or downgraded depending on what type of approach is going to be flown. So, if several items are missing, the runway might only be allowed to be used in very good visibility or with a high cloud base. Also, for runways that are used in low visibility, ICAO imposes a maximum spacing of 60 meters between runway edge lights in order to make the runway as distinctive as possible, which obviously was not being met here. So, with all of this, you might be wondering whether it was even allowed to dispatch a flight towards this airport at night, and the answer is actually yeah. Like I mentioned before, we pilots are supposed to increase the minimum visibility required for an approach depending on which lighting systems are out of service or working, but even if the forecasted visibility doesn't meet those new requirements, we can still dispatch towards that airport as long as we have enough fuel to reach at least 2 alternate airports, which have better weather and equipment, enough to satisfy all of the rules. As a result, these pilots most likely read those NOTAMs and the weather forecast and concluded that they would definitely need to take these precautions, but if worse came to worse, they could just divert. The forecast for Surat Thani on that day showed that, in general, the conditions were pretty good, with a visibility of 7 kilometers and intermittent rain showers, scattered to broken clouds at 1,800 feet and an overcast layer at 11,000 feet. But it did also warn that intermittent storms could pass over the airport, temporarily reducing the visibility down to 1,500 meters in rain, with scattered clouds at 1,200 feet and broken at 2,000, as well as with variable winds at 15 knots gusting to 25. Now, if Flight 261 were to encounter those conditions, well, then landing at the airport with its degraded lighting and without an ILS could be difficult to even impossible. But since those conditions were expected to be just intermittent, the pilots probably expected that they could just then wait for the visibility to improve. In any case, due to this, they now loaded the aircraft up with a full 15.7 tons of fuel, which was enough to fly to their destination, make several approaches, then hold for a bit, and then finally fly all the way back to Bangkok again if needed. And that extra fuel brought the total takeoff weight up to about 108 tons, which was still far below the A310's maximum takeoff weight of 142 tons, meaning that they would be fairly light. And whilst that might seem like a good thing, in this particular story, it would come with some truly nasty consequences. And talking of which, did you know that scammers can now use AI to clone voices? Well, what they do is, first they buy your phone number from data brokers, and then they make a robocall to you to sample your voice, which is then cloned using AI. After that, they can use that voice clone to call up your family and friends pretending to be you in an emergency asking for money. And since that will sound exactly like you, it often works. In my family, we have actually adopted a code word for this exact reason, but another thing that I highly recommend is to use today's sponsor, Incogni. As soon as you sign up with them, they will start scanning all data brokers out there for your data, and when they find it, they will send out an instruction to delete your data from their services. Incogni will then handle all paperwork needed, follow up on objections and so on until all of your data has been removed, and they will keep searching for your data out there for as long as you stay with them. Now, you could theoretically do all of this yourself, but it would take up a lot of your time because there are just so many data brokers out there. So I would highly suggest to use Incogni instead, which is what I did. Now, after you've signed up, you can then track their progress in real time through their dashboard, which is awesome. Plus, with their family and friends plan, you can add up to 4 loved ones to your plan, which is a really nice touch. So to get started and get an awesome 60% discount, click on this QR code or go to incogni.com/pilot. Just remember to use the code PILOT at checkout. Thank you, Incogni. Now let's get back to the video. After having completed all of the pre-flight checks, Flight 261 pushed back, taxied out to the runway and finally took off at time 17:54, climbing into the darkening evening with the captain at the controls as pilot flying and the first officer handling the radios. The climb to their cruise altitude of 31,000 feet was then completed uneventful, and they proceeded south for about half an hour without any issues. Then at time 18:26, when they were about halfway through the flight, the first officer called up Surat Thani approach and was told to expect a VOR DME approach to runway 22. Now, the pilots accepted this, set up and briefed for that approach, and the controller then began to give them radar vectors and descent clearances down towards that approach. But before we get to that, we need to talk a little bit about the specific procedures that were involved in this approach that they were soon about to fly. Or actually, procedures, because in a very strange twist, there were actually two of them. A VOR-DME approach is a non-precision approach, which means that while it does provide pilots with lateral guidance to align with the runway, it doesn't provide any vertical guidance to help them descend on the correct slope. In order to fly this type of approach, the pilots must first tune in to a VOR radio beacon, or very high frequency omnidirectional range, located at or near the airport. And this VOR will then emit modulated signals that allow the aircraft's VOR receivers to determine the exact bearing from the VOR to the plane, similar to the spokes of a bicycle wheel, divided into 360 degrees of so-called radials. During the VOR approach, the pilots will then fly inbound towards the VOR on a specific radial, which will be lining up close to the runway heading, whilst also descending to predetermined altitudes at certain distances from the runway. And those distances are monitored by tuning into a distance measuring equipment, or DME, which is usually co-located with VOR, hence the name VOR-DME. Now, in the case of runway 22 at Surat Thani, the VOR approach was a bit unusual, because the approach course was actually offset from the runway direction by quite a large amount. That could have been for many reasons, but in this case, the VOR wasn't located on the extended centerline, but instead on the left side of the airport, seen from the runway 22 direction. And that meant that flying straight towards it on the runway heading of 225 degrees would cause the plane to fly on the left side of the actual final approach track throughout the entire approach. So instead, this VOR-DME approach was designed with an approach course that was offset in a way that meant that the plane would start off too far to the right of the centerline before crossing the extended runway centerline close to the threshold, so that if the aircraft would be visual at that point, the pilots can just make a slight right turn and line up with the runway centerline just before landing. Now, the Thai Department of Aviation had produced a VOR-DME approach chart with an inbound course of 204 degrees, which would mean a very large 21-degree offset. And if that course was followed, it would cause the aircraft to cross the extended runway centerline at a distance of 1,800 meters from the threshold, which was pretty okay. And that chart was available in the cockpit of Flight 261, but it wasn't the only chart they had. You see, Thai Airways had also produced its own chart for the runway 22 VOR approach, and it contained a number of key differences. For example, the two charts had different missed approach points, where the pilots must go around if they couldn't see the runway. They also showed different altitudes that the pilots should climb to in case of a go-around, and the Department of Aviation's chart strangely didn't specify a minimum visibility, whilst the Thai Airways chart imposed a minimum of 2,000 meters. But finally, the Thai Airways chart also specified an approach course of 215 degrees instead of the 204 degrees shown on the DOA chart. And that meant that it was much closer to the runway heading of 225 degrees and therefore would require less of a turn to align with the runway. But that also meant that the approach course would cross the runway extended centerline further away from the threshold, at a distance of 4,800 meters to be exact, which in practical terms meant that a higher visibility was needed to fly the Thai Airways variant of the approach, since the point where the pilots would have to make the right turn to visually align with the runway was further away. But like I mentioned before, the minimum visibility printed on the Thai Airways chart was only 2,000 meters. So if the pilots caught sight of the runway at that distance, they would have already passed the centerline to the left, making it difficult to maneuver in for landing. In reality, the practical minimum visibility for this approach was much higher than stated, but that wasn't mentioned anywhere. Maybe you're starting to see the problem? Back on board Flight 261, the controller's vectors had soon brought them onto the approach course, and by the time the cockpit voice recorder started, at time 1837, they were already established towards the VOR. The two pilots were using the Thai Airways approach chart with the inbound course of 215 degrees, which is the one where the visual turn towards the runway had to be made about 4,800 meters away. But when the pilots contacted the tower, they were told that the latest weather report gave winds calm, visibility 1,500 meters in light rain, and a cloud base at 1,800 feet, which was obviously much less than the minimum visibility of 2,000 meters depicted on their approach chart, even before taking into account the effects of all of those inoperative lights at the airport. Now, in that situation, in most countries, we have something known as an approach ban, which states that it is not legal to continue an approach beyond the final approach fix or equivalent position unless the reported visibility would improve above the minimums. And we have that because if the visibility is below the minimum, the chances of a successful landing are just very, very low. So there's really no reason to put yourself in a situation where you're close to the ground in instrument conditions, just praying for the runway to miraculously appear in front of you. This approach ban actually gives crews the tools needed to just say no at an early stage, to climb back out and then hold until the visibility either improves or a diversion is initiated. But in this case, the pilots decided to attempt the approach anyway, and the final report doesn't really explain why, nor points to this as a serious violation. It is possible that there was confusion about the minimum visibility because the DOA chart didn't specify one. Maybe it was just normal at Thai Airways to ignore their own company minimums, or they thought that the conditions might improve before they reached the runway, since the forecast said that those periods of low visibility should be temporary. We just don't really know. In any case, after passing the intermediate approach fix, 11 miles out from the VOR, the tower controller reminded the pilots that the right side poppy lights were out of service and that the spacing of the runway edge and threshold lights was increased. The pilots acknowledged this and then continued the landing checklist, lowering the landing gear, extending the flaps to full and notifying the cabin crew to take their positions for landing. In front of them, their landing lights now illuminated only clouds and rain, while the windscreen wipers swished forth and back trying to keep the windows clear. At time 1841, the first officer reported that they had reached the final approach fix, located 6 nautical miles from the VOR, which, like I mentioned, is the furthest that you can normally, legally go if the visibility is below the minimum. But instead of abandoning the approach here, the pilots just continued their descent down to the minimum descent altitude, or MDA, of 430 feet, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. Now today, this would be a quite serious violation, which would definitely make you fail a line check if you were doing one, but it's possible that the rules were different in Thailand back then, or that these kind of things had been normalized at Thai Airways for some reason. The controller soon reported that the aircraft was not in sight, but cleared them to land anyway, along with giving them a new reported wind of 310 degrees at 5 knots. The first officer read back that landing clearance, and the tower then cautioned them that the runway was wet. After this, the first officer quickly verified that the landing checklist had been completed, and a few moments later, the tower controller asked again whether they had the runway in sight. Around this time, the dim lights of the runway actually did appear through the mist, so the first officer now confirmed, "Runway in sight!" And that was then followed by the captain disconnecting the autopilot and auto throttle and beginning to steer towards the runway heading. But now the first officer noticed that they weren't properly positioned to land, so he called out, "Pull up, 2,000 set, sir," referring to the go-around altitude of 2,000 feet. You see, likely because of the combination of the offset approach and the low visibility, they had simply spotted the runway too late. So making that visual right turn to align properly with it was now not possible, which, to be honest, was quite predictable. But in spite of this, the captain now asked, "Is that the right one?" And the first officer repeated, right hand side." "Where?" said the captain, to which the first officer repeated himself again, and at that point the captain just uttered a curse and said, Okay, that's right, go around." He initiated the go-around procedure by slowly increasing thrust towards the takeoff go-around or toga setting, allowing the pitch to gently increase towards the go-around attitude. Now, the procedure for a go-around on the Airbus A310 was to increase thrust to toga, hold the pitch angle at a maximum of 18 degrees pitch up, and then retract the landing gear and then flaps before climbing to the go-around altitude, which in this case was 2,000 feet. But one counterintuitive aspect of this procedure was that in order to maintain a pitch of 18 degrees, pilots might actually have to push forward on the controls instead of pulling back. And that was because aircraft with engines mounted below the center of mass, like the A310 had, will experience a pitch-up moment when the engine thrust is increased. And that's especially noticeable when the aircraft is light, like it was in this case. Now, if you imagine a 2D aircraft pinned to a wall with a pin through the center of mass, if you then grab the plane below that pin and push it forward, it will then rotate about the pin, bringing the nose up, right? Well, that is essentially what happens, and these aircraft will do the same thing, but when the autopilot is engaged, it will counteract this pitch-up moment by applying nose-down elevator as needed to prevent the pitch from exceeding 18 degrees. But if the autopilot is off, well, then the pilot will need to adjust that pitch manually, and in some cases that might require some quite quick and assertive control input to prevent the pitch from getting too high. In this case though, the captain was fairly conservative with his thrust increase, taking a full 23 seconds to reach the toga setting. But even though that was the case, he still didn't use enough pitch down inputs here. So the pitch initially increased to 24 degrees before he was able to get it back down to 18. Now, just for context, we consider an unintentional pitch up of 25 degrees or more to be an in-flight upset. So this wasn't great. Nevertheless, the captain kept the plane under control and the pilots executed the rest of the missed approach procedure without any real issues, climbing back to 2,000 feet and then requesting a return back to the final approach fix, which the tower controller quickly granted them. After having completed the initial turn, the captain then clarified to his first officer that he would now do a teardrop course reversal and then attempt the approach again. And he then added, "Too close, we were off to the left, weren't we?" On top of that, he also then mentioned that there had been a high rate of climb during the go-around, to which the first officer correctly replied, "It might be because we are very light." But there was no further discussion of this or any kind of internal debrief on how to avoid it the next time, nor any discussion about the poor weather at this point. So the pilots just executed that teardrop maneuver and went straight back into a second approach. Now at this point, it would have made a lot of sense to instead enter into holding and wait for the visibility to improve. After all, they had plenty of fuel with them. But neither pilot seemed to even wanting to suggest that. Instead, the first officer just obliquely asked, "Do you want me to ask if it's raining at the airfield or not?" To which the captain told him to ask for the visibility instead, which makes sense. But the first officer just went ahead and asked whether it was raining anyway. To which he was told by the controller that, yeah, there's some light rain over the field. The investigators noted that the first officer might not have actually correctly heard the captain's instruction to ask for the visibility instead, because the captain seemed to be very soft-spoken. But if that was the case, the captain could have easily just repeated his requests. But that did not happen here, which possibly points to a bit of lack of crew resource management, which is something that this crew would definitely come to need. Once again, the pilots now lined up for the VR approach after having made a quick PA to the passengers about not having been able to land and that they would try again. They then assumed the approach course of 215 degrees, completed the landing checklist again and begun descending. At time 1852, the controller again cleared Flight 261 to land, and just 1 minute later the captain could be heard complaining about the offset approach course, noting that it was difficult to land like this, and the first officer agreed. In the background, the cockpit voice recorder captured the sound of the windscreen wipers running at high setting, and as we could hear that, the tower controller also came in and asked for their intentions. The first officer responded that the runway still was not in sight at that point, and 5 seconds later, the captain asked if the runway was off to the right, to which the first officer said he wasn't sure, he could only see intermittent red lights. The captain now added that they were too far left of the runway and asked whether they had passed it already, suggesting that they should go around. So the first officer again confirmed that the go-around altitude of 2,000 feet was set, and the captain again used the go-around switches on the thrust levers. But this time, this put the autopilot and auto throttle into go-around mode for an automatic go-around, since he had never disconnected the automatics on this approach. The auto throttle now quickly spooled the engines up to toga thrust in about 8 seconds, while the autopilot applied nose-down elevator to keep the pitch from rising above 18 degrees in a smooth and controlled way. The aircraft then climbed to 2,000 feet again and executed the missed approach checklist, and after that, the captain said that this time he would bring them all the way out to the intermediate approach fix at 11 miles from the VR before coming back in. Maybe he wanted to do that in an effort to slow things down a bit and allow for the weather to improve, but it was never really discussed. He also continued to complain about the fact that the approach was not in line with the runway, and the first officer explained that he had seen some lights earlier, but with so many runway lights out of service, he wasn't sure whether it was the runway or a fishing boat that he had seen, and he didn't want to mislead the captain. And to be honest, if there is a doubt between those two things, that was probably a good idea. Now at this point, the pilots also had to make a choice about how they were going to proceed, and if they should even try for an approach a third time, which in my view should have been a pretty easy choice. At my old airline, we weren't even allowed to attempt a third approach unless the visibility had doubled from the previous attempts and obviously was above the minimums. So realistically speaking, the best course of action here would have been to either hold and wait for the visibility to improve substantially or just divert back to Bangkok. But instead of having this crucial discussion, the captain just told the first officer to request another approach, which he promptly did. Now most likely the captain was feeling some pressure here to get his passengers to their destination, whether that pressure was self-induced or otherwise, so he now became narrowly focused on accomplishing that goal. And with that mindset, he must have concluded that there was no harm in just trying again. Maybe this time it would work. But the truth here is that if you have failed twice, chances are that you'll fail a third time as well. And if you do that, well, then you will be even more tired than you were on the first two. And this is where the pilot monitoring must step in and become the voice of reason. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. Instead, the captain now made another PA to the passengers, informing them that he would try the approach one more time and then return to Bangkok if it failed. But there was still no discussion around that decision with his first officer. As they positioned for the third approach, pushing through the clouds and rain, the captain was clearly still focused on those earlier failed approaches. He complained that they couldn't turn in time because they had gained visuals too close to the runway, and he joked nervously that if they didn't land on time, well then this plane might not be available for its next scheduled flights over to Chiang Mai. Then, as they ran through the landing checklist for the third time, he repeatedly said, "It's too close." And he then asked his first officer to inform Thai Airways operations of their plans to go back to Bangkok if this approach was unsuccessful. Just a few moments later, at time 19:05, the captain's worst fears were confirmed as the tower controller informed them that the visibility had now reduced down to only 1,000 meters. On the cockpit voice recorder, you could hear the captain mumble to himself, 1,000 meters, unable. And that clearly showed that he knew that continuing this approach beyond this point was likely just a fool's errand. But perhaps out of some misplaced hope that somehow this approach would be different, he still didn't abandon it. Now, remember what I said about how minimums exist to keep us pilots from pushing ahead into bad conditions hoping for a miracle? Well, this is an excellent example of why that is. The first officer now asked the controller again whether it was raining at the field, and she replied that there was indeed still some light rain and that the runway was wet, and she then cleared them to land. And to this, the captain responded that since they were now clear to land, they might as well try the approach anyway, showing that maybe this clearance was what pushed this decision over the edge, even though obviously the controller had no say in that matter. After finishing the landing checklist, the captain confirmed that they were on course, and he then asked the first officer if he could see the runway this time, but he didn't get any reply back. At 100 feet above the MDA, the captain disconnected the autopilot and attempted to turn inbound to where he thought that the runway should be, but just seconds later the runway lights appeared through the rain, predictably still way too far off to the right. So the captain now exclaimed, "Oh, we can't make it, we cannot land," and he then called for the third go-around for the night. The first officer called for him to press the go-around switch or go lever, which he did, but there was a crucial difference this time. You see, he hadn't disconnected the auto throttle. Remember, during the first go-around, both the autopilot and the auto throttle had been disconnected, and the captain then increased thrust manually, really slowly over 23 seconds, and was therefore able to keep the pitch under control, albeit barely. And then, during the second go-around, both the automatic systems had been engaged, so whilst the auto throttle had advanced thrust rapidly in just 8 seconds, the autopilot had quickly compensated for the sudden pitch up to keep the pitch at or under 18 degrees. Now, those two previous go-arounds had likely set the captain's unconscious expectations of what would happen now during the start of this third go-around, but of course this time, when the auto throttle increased thrust to toga in 8 seconds, the autopilot wasn't there to help, so it was now entirely up to him to keep the pitch angle under control. In such a light aircraft, by this point down to only 102 tons and with a slightly aft center of gravity, a rather aggressive pitch down input would be needed. And this was especially true since in the go-around mode, the Airbus A310's auto throttle appears to always use maximum thrust, which in this case was 102% N1. Now, that is way more than this particular aircraft needed for this go-around, and I am surprised that it was set up that way. On the Boeing 737 that I fly, pressing the toga switches once will give you a reduced go-around thrust of around 90% N1, which will lead to a smooth and controlled go-around with around 2,000 feet per minute rate of climb. And if you want max thrust for whatever reason, well then you have to then press the switch again. But as far as I can tell, the Airbus A310 doesn't seem to have that option. Now, if you are an A310 pilot or used to be, let me know if that's the case in the comments below. In any case, the result of the engines now spooling up this way was a very fast pitch-up momentum, which had to be countered aggressively. But it seems like the captain's mind was at this point still focused on the reasons behind the failed approaches, because even as he made the standard go-around callouts, he also added things like too close, cannot land. All meanwhile, the nose of his aircraft was now rising higher and higher, shooting through 18 degrees in just a few seconds. So he needed to react immediately to this, but in his distraction and complacency, that didn't happen. Now, this sequence of events is actually eerily similar to another accident involving the very similar Airbus A300, which had happened earlier in that same year. In February of 1998, China Airlines Flight 676 was approaching Taipei, Taiwan, when the captain decided to execute a go-around. But moments before that, he had applied some force onto the control column, enough to actually exceed the autopilot's automatic disconnect function, which he had then noticed, but likely hadn't fully processed when he pressed the go-around switches. As a result of that, the auto throttle spooled up the engines to go-around power rapidly and the nose started to climb, but the captain initially failed to intervene because he was expecting the autopilot to hold the pitch. And as a result, the pitch angle quickly exceeded 40 degrees nose up, the aircraft stalled, and Flight 676 plummeted into a residential street before the captain had any chance to recover. The sad outcome was the loss of 202 lives. Now, both that China Airlines captain and this captain likely understood the physics involved here. They knew that their low-slung engines would cause a pitch-up moment when the thrust was increased, so the reason both of them failed to action it wasn't because they didn't understand the principle, but instead likely because their mental model of how the aircraft was going to react to their inputs was based on inaccurate starting conditions. In the case of the China Airlines captain, he hadn't realized that the autopilot was off and therefore hadn't mentally prepared himself to take manual control of the airplane's pitch. And the captain of this aircraft knew that the autopilot was off because he had intentionally disconnected it just a few seconds earlier, but he hadn't taken the time to anticipate how the reaction would be from the aircraft when the auto throttle was still on, and how that would be different from the previous two go-arounds. On top of that, he was likely still under stress from these 3 failed approaches and was probably feeling quite frustrated, which might have reduced his focus on the basic piloting skills that was now in front of him. And also, by the way, on the 737, we don't have automatic go-around capability for most of our approaches, only autolands, so we are quite familiar with the handling of manual go-arounds. But on an aircraft like the Airbus A310, which can perform automatic go-arounds, I can kind of see how the demands of a sudden manual go-around could catch a pilot off guard. But the result of all of these factors was that the captain now pushed forward way too gently to stop the pitch from increasing. In fact, he used less than 50% of the control authority that was available to him, and consequently the pitch increased past 18 degrees to 25, then 30, then nearly 40 degrees. At that point, the captain did push forward for about 5 to 6 seconds, which briefly brought the nose back down to about 30 degrees, but then he let go again. The nose rotated back up past 40 degrees and then to almost 50, which is incredible. Now obviously, this caused the aircraft's speed to just quickly wash off, and its angle of attack soon approached what was needed for an aerodynamic stall. From the ground, if anyone would have been able to see this, it would have looked like the aircraft was basically hanging almost motionless in the sky like a big cross. In fact, only 19 seconds after the captain had pressed the go-around switches, the stall warning activated, shaking the pilot's control columns and triggering a loud cricket alarm in the cockpit. Now, the correct response to that warning would have been to immediately push the nose down to reduce the angle of attack and increase the airspeed, which is something that we pilots practice so frequently that it should become second nature to us. But time and time again, history has shown that sometimes pilots react in the complete opposite way, by pulling back. Now, we don't know exactly why this happens, but there are a couple of hypotheses that we can put out there. One possibility is that when a stall warning catches a pilot by surprise, a deeper, more basal instinct takes over, which is the instinct to reach out, grab the control column and pull it closer to one's body. This is possibly a reaction to acute stress, much like when a situation catches you by surprise while you're driving and suddenly you're white-knuckling the steering wheel and sitting up extra straight in your seat. But of course, if you do this in an airplane under these kind of circumstances, you'll end up pulling back on the yoke and raising the nose even further, which in a stall situation could kill you. Now, the whole purpose of stall training is to make sure that our instinctive reaction to the sound of the stick shaker is to push the controls forward without even having any time to think about it. But like I said, occasionally for some individuals, maybe that training doesn't quite stick. Alternatively, another reason for the captain's behavior could have been a sort of reverse somatogravic illusion. Now, if you're a regular viewer of this channel, you might remember that the somatogravic illusion occurs when an acceleration force pushes the pilots back in their seat, causing them to falsely believe that the airplane is in a pitch up. Well, in this case, the plane really was pitching up very steeply, so gravity was pressing the pilots back into their seats, while the engines were screaming at max thrust. So it is possible that the captain therefore became disoriented and interpreted these cues to mean that the airplane was accelerating rapidly and would overspeed unless he pulled up to slow it down. Either way, what we know is that as the first officer exclaimed in surprise at the stall warning, the captain now grabbed his control column and for a couple of brief panicked seconds pulled it towards his body, turning a dangerous situation into something truly catastrophic. The pitch quickly increased to nearly 60 degrees as the airspeed plummeted to below 30 knots, which obviously caused the aircraft to go into a fully developed aerodynamic stall. And at a height of just 1,880 feet, this situation was now completely unrecoverable. The only way to regain energy would have been to descend, but there wasn't enough altitude left to get the speed back up before they hit the ground. As the airplane entered this stall, the loss of airflow over the ailerons also led to a loss of roll control, and the airplane therefore swayed wildly from side to side as it fell, banking first 120 degrees right, then back 50 degrees left, 60 degrees right, and then left again. The first officer now shouted and called for full thrust, but the engines were already producing that. And still, the captain clung to the control column, holding it in the nearly full nose-up position. But of course, with the aircraft in a fully developed aerodynamic stall, its effect was now limited, so the nose soon dropped anyway, falling below the horizon as the plane plunged towards the ground below. There were just enough time for the ground proximity warning system to call out,
"Don't think." Minimum 100.
And then it was over. At time 19:08 and 25 seconds, Flight 261 crashed into a flooded plantation with a nearly neutral pitch attitude and a high rate of descent. The impact severely damaged the aircraft, but due to its very low forward speed and the swampy terrain at the impact site, only 51 of the 146 occupants perished in the impact itself. Unfortunately though, a fire soon erupted from the left wing and then spread quickly through the fuselage, forcing the survivors to flee as best as they could from the badly mangled cabin. And tragically, many were unable to do so. Medical examinations later showed that 50 people died primarily due to the effects of the fire, bringing the total death toll to 101, including both of the pilots, whilst only 45 were able to escape. Now, the final report of this accident was among the very worst that I've ever read. It was missing loads of key information. The analysis was only surface level, and it had some factual errors that were thankfully called out in the comments left by the French BEA, who participated in the investigation on behalf of Airbus. As a result, my team and I had to combine the raw flight data and the cockpit transcript with our knowledge of aircraft performance and human factors in order to explain why the pilots of this flight made certain decisions, as well as why they ultimately lost control of their airplane. And I want to especially highlight two things that I think that we can learn from this. Firstly, the captain of this flight didn't effectively control his aircraft during either of the manual go-arounds because he wasn't anticipating its behavior and his control inputs were just too timid. These are both signs of a pilot who maybe didn't get enough manual flight time and therefore wasn't comfortable using the control authority that he had. So if you are a pilot out there, try to get some hand flying in when it's safe and suitable to do so. The second lesson has to do with risk-taking. This crew decided to attempt a third approach, and basically all of these approaches on the conditions that they knew would likely preclude a successful landing. And the captain still disconnected the autopilot and tried to line up with a runway that he couldn't clearly see, putting himself and his crew and aircraft in a situation where he had to hand fly a go-around at night in marginal conditions close to the ground. This is a situation that we'd prefer not to put ourselves in if we can help it, which is why we're supposed to comply with stipulated weather minima in the first place. Now, I want to really shout out my scriptwriter Kira for this script, where she has done a lot of great work. I am so proud of my entire team for all of the hard work that they do, and that is made possible both by the support of our sponsors, which I hope you will check out, but especially by our fantastic private sponsors in the Patreon crew. Now, if you want to support us as well and get to see my upcoming videos, both here on Mentor Pilot and on Blackbox and Mentor Now, before everyone else, well then scan this QR code or go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot, because I would really love to see you there. Here are also some great comments that you guys posted in our last video, and I love both responding to them and reading them. They're great. My name is Petter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.